Imagine a world where more women had the time to fully explore their genius. Welcome to She Rebel Radio, a community-driven podcast dedicated to supporting women leaders to unlearn conventional rules and create their businesses of significance. This is our International Women's Day Inspire series with our headline partners, NatWest. NatWest has been a pioneer in supporting women in business since 2019. We have 10 new guests sharing their stories with you to inspire, to educate, and to empower. As you navigate this series with us, I'd love for you to consider, what is inspiring you for 2024? How do you personally make it work as a woman in business? And what change would you make to your industry to inspire more inclusion of women? My name's Lulu Minns. I host retreats and create spaces for women leaders to explore their genius. And today, I'm going to create that same space right here for you on this podcast. Welcome to episode 135 of She Rebel Radio, Inspiring Your Narrative with Nikki Marmery. The author of Lilith, Nikki Marmery, joins me today to share with us more about her joyous rampage through biblical history, where she retells the story of Lilith, Adam's first wife in the Garden of Eden. Lilith, who is banished from the Garden of Eden for disobedience, visits and collaborates with other female biblical characters, and as she has already tasted fruit from the tree of knowledge, she spends thousands of years trying to restore natural balance and the power of the feminine back into the world. This is a very bold and ambitious book, and Nikki's first book, On Wilder Seas, also gives voice to another woman written out of history, and it was shortlisted for a historical fiction award and also a prestigious book club. Previously, Nikki worked as a financial journalist, and she now writes fiction from her small village near Aversham in the UK, where she lives with her husband and 3 children. Nikki, it's amazing to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. And thank you so much for having me, Lulu. I'm really thrilled to be talking to you today. Yeah, I'm just so looking forward to this discussion because you've sort of identified so many of the things that that I wanted to talk about in my novel, and so many of the things that sort of really get to the heart of what I was writing about.
Perfect. So in Lilith, you don't just retell her story, but you include many female biblical characters, which is very brave to take on. When did you first feel inspired to write the book?
Well, I think it's actually the themes of the book are things that I've been thinking about, all my life, really, about, how women came to be seen as inferior, when that happened, why it happened, and the consequences of that for us in the modern day. These are things that, I've spent my life thinking about. Um, and, having heard the myth of Lilith as Adam's first wife, who was created equal to Adam, but then was evicted from the Garden of Eden when she tried to assert her equality, I thought that was such a sort of a great sort of mythical metaphor for something that actually did happen in prehistory, which is, women were equal and had status and power and divinity. And then this is taken away from them, as the first patriarchies emerge. So it just struck me as a really good sort of metaphor for women's loss of equality and status in the ancient world, in the Bronze Age, in the Levant and that area, and then eventually all over the world. It just struck me as a sort of a really good way of telling that story of something that did happen in the real world. But as I explored it, I just realized it was just so much bigger than that. Because this thing that happened to Lilith and it happened over and over again, and that is the erasure of female divinity, the suppression of female power. And it didn't just happen, once in prehistory. It just happened over and over and over again. And every time women sort of acquired any status or power or asserted their divinity or spirituality in any way, it just got crushed. And so I realized it was just so much bigger than this one story, is sort of mythologized in Genesis. It was everything. And so I kind of realized that what I was writing wasn't a novella, which is what I had sort of started out with. I realized it was really big, and it was going to include all sorts of other women in the Bible who the same thing happens over and over again. You know, they get slandered, erased, dismissed, just horribly misrepresented because they're women. So that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and what I love about that, Nikki, is two things that you've said there, which are extremely important. Is one is, you know, remembering that we were equal, we did have power, status, and divinity. It was taken away. That wasn't our starting point. And secondly, I love how you've shared there, you know, because it's kind of work that I do, is that cycles are repeated over and over and over again until we get to the source of why that's happening, and we dig it up and we start to change it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you just see the same pattern happening over and over again in so many things. And it's enraging, absolutely enraging. And I think, you know, I think a lot of women sort of observe these things all their life, and then something happens to them in their 40s, say, and they just have had enough. They have just absolutely had enough of this thing that they've seen happen over and over again throughout their lives.
Yeah.
And it came to me at that point in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can go into it, can't we, in kind of male dominated environments. You know, I know you were a financial journalist, I was a lawyer, with a certain degree of naivety, and then, you know,
Yeah.
it starts to dawn on you, and then you start to see it everywhere, and then you can't unsee it.
Absolutely, and I think as well, I mean, there's a certain amount, you know, I don't know about you, but when I first started out in my career, I felt very grateful. I felt really grateful to be allowed, you know, a place at the table, and I didn't want to rock the boat. You know, I was, you know, a female editor on a financial magazine, and there weren't many,
Mm-hmm.
so I felt, you know, that I had been lucky to get this position. I never wanted to draw attention to the fact that I was female, and that meant not making a fuss when there were really quite extreme episodes of sexual harassment or, you know, anything like that. I didn't want to draw attention to it because I didn't want to draw attention to the fact that I was female. And I think as you get older, you realize you don't have to deny the fact that you're female. You know, that's not the way to change things. You know, the way to change things is to say, you know, women, you don't have to be like men. You know,
Mm-hmm.
what's wrong is that the world that we have was made by men, by and for men, at a point in history when women were not, you know, part of that. We weren't included in that, in any of that discussion, or, you know, any of these systems that we now have, government, legislature. You know, women weren't involved when these were all being set up, and so they, you know, they don't function for us.
No, and we're beyond the point, I think, and that's a big message of She Rebel Radio, of squeezing ourselves to fit into it. How can we embrace being female, feminine based principles, and actually change those systems?
Absolutely, yes, and those were sort of things that really guided me as I was writing this book.
Yeah, and it must have been a huge amount of research that you had to undertake to, you know, dig into this story of anything that you can share with us about that.
Yes, well, it took about 4 years, and I wrote it throughout lockdown, so I had a lot of time. Although I also had three children homeschooling at the time, but it kind of gave me this sort of freedom from, you know, being that sort of isolated from the real world as we all were during that period, was actually very freeing in many ways. And I'm not sure I would have written this book sort of during normal times, because I think it was that sort of severing from the real world that allowed me to really sort of go into the deep past and think very, very, very deeply about, you know, all the things that I think have gone wrong with this world, you know, going back thousands of years. I always like to take a really long view. So it kind of enabled me to do that, which was fantastic. And it meant I, you know, was able to sort of plunge myself into that research. And I sort of quickly found, you know, I'd written my first book at the British Library because a lot of the manuscripts and documents I needed were there. And I just, you know, obviously all the libraries were closed, and so I didn't have that opportunity. But I realized that actually everything I need is all really readily available. You know, the Bible, you know, you can famously get
Yes.
quite and there's just so much translated scriptures and ancient texts online that are completely accessible. And one of the things I did a lot when writing this book actually was, if I was looking at a sort of a particular passage in the Bible, I would look at the many different translations of it over time, because you can sort of visibly see a change in meaning over time. And if you can visibly see where things have been changed and how it alters the meaning slightly. So that I was able to do all of that online. I didn't need a library for that, and sort of all the sort of ancient texts that I've used, like the Gnostic Gospels, are all available online. So yes, it was actually sort of the perfect book to write in lockdown.
Yeah, and kind of removing yourself from, as we all were, the systems and structures that exist that are, masculine based and dominated.
And it enables you to see them more clearly, and it enables you to see the absurdity really clearly when you're so separated from it. I think, a lot of the time writing this book, it was that the sheer absurdity of what we have been asked to accept for at least 2,500 years. It strikes me as completely insane. It was definitely helped by that sort of particular that particular point in history. Right.
Yeah, I think it's really marked a transition in so many ways. So can you tell us more about the original story of Lilith in the Bible? Obviously there are many different forms, but what has been the dominant narrative about her for thousands of years?
Well, Lilith is fascinating, in fact, because she's much, much, much older than the Bible. She is probably the oldest female archetype in myth, and she goes back nearly 5,000 years to ancient Iraq, ancient Sumer, which is now modern Iraq. And she started life as this sort of night demon figure, a female sort of night demon figure. She's mentioned in one of the oldest works of literature in the world. She's mentioned in a myth called Inanna and the Hulapu tree, where the goddess Inanna has to ask the hero Gilgamesh to get rid of these pests that she's got in her sacred tree. And one of the pests is the Lilith, which is this night demon. She started life in ancient Sumer as a sort of a demonic figure, and she preyed on pregnant women and children. And there's a brilliant book by Sarah Clegg called Woman's Law, which sort of traces the evolution of Lilith over the archetype over the past 5,000 years. And she sort of argued very convincingly, actually, that Lilith started off as a woman's, as a conceptualization by women, because it's all to do with fears of childbirth. It's to do with fears of, pregnancy and childbirth was obviously incredibly dangerous for women up until the arrival of modern medicine, and that some statistics suggest that 1 in 3 children would die before their 5th birthday, and so that that horror of your child dying is so immense, and one way to control that is to imagine a sort of a demonic figure is responsible. It's not random. There's a demonic figure, and if there's a demonic figure, the demonic figure can be placated. So that's Sarah's interpretation of how Lilith started. But she then sort of crosses cultures. She sort of appears in pretty much every culture that has roots in the Levant and West Asia, and that's where she sort of she arrives into the Hebrew canon, where she arrives again as a sort of a night demon. She preys on pregnant women and children. She seduces men in their sleep. And so that's by sort of the the first millennium BC, she's arrived in the Levant, in where the ancient Israelites were living. She crosses into ancient Greek mythology. In fact, everywhere, pretty much everywhere. From all the way up to Russia, all the way over to France. She's everywhere. But this idea, her link to the Bible, actually doesn't come until much, much later. The first mention of her as Adam's first wife doesn't come until the early medieval era, and that's in a Hebrew text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. And that it's a satirical text, so it's actually not really clear. It's obviously sort of critiquing a well-known story, but we don't have we don't have that sort of a version of that well-known story. All we have is satire. So we don't know, what's been invented in that satire and what is there in the original. But that story, tells us that Lilith is the wife of Adam. She was created equal to Adam. But when Adam insists on her lying beneath him to have sex, she's not having it. She wants to go on top. And because of that, she refuses Adam's authority, and she utters the ineffable name of God and sprouts wings and leaves paradise. And she goes to the Red Sea, and these angels are sent to try and compel her to go back to Adam, and she refuses. And then after that, she becomes a demonic. She becomes, what she already has been in real life for sort of 2,000 years at this point. She becomes the demonic figure. This is the backstory to explain, something that already exists, the demonic figure of Lilith. So she's not. There's in fact only one mention of her in the Bible. And it's in this sort of character as a night demon that she appears there, and it's in Isaiah, and so the one mention of her is that it's sort of talking about sort of all this dark demons. It says wild cats will meet hyenas, the goat demon will call to his friends, and there Lilith will lurk and find her resting place. So that is the only sort of biblical reference to her, and that's because her link to her sort of appearance as Adam's first wife is kind of sort of tagged on much later.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? Coming from the legal world, not that I worked in family, as a family practitioner, but, as her leaving Adam and refusing to go back, kind of how traditionally women have been treated in divorce courts and stuff, but, breaking out of that, contractual agreement and, the demonizing that happens when women do that.
Because how dare they? How dare they break out of that sort of expected role? And that's why I think she's such an attractive figure to women. That sort of escaping domesticity, refusing Adam, refusing his authority. That's just incredibly appealing. But of course, for the bulk of history, that story has been told by men. And so when men tell that story, she's this evil, demonic figure. And it's only really in the modern era that women have found that story and thought, hang on a minute, no, she's a total heroine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what's not to like? She sounds amazing. So that's why I love myth, really, that it's just constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, and it completely depends on who tells the story.
And it charts back, so deeply. There's always, an element of it. So what's some of the key changes that you've made to the narrative of Lilith? And I think you've already shared some of what your inspiration for doing that was. This is a woman's version of Lilith, right?
Yeah. Well, for a start, she's not a demon. I'm not having that. No, she is not demonic in any way. My Lilith. She is the first woman. She's the first woman. She's the equal woman, and she is absolutely furious because obviously she's been thrown out of paradise. For what? For asserting her equality. That's not very fair, is it? And then she starts to sort of question that, and really, sort of my book, is it doesn't take much from all of these sort of mythologies of Lilith as this demonic figure. It kind of departs from that, really, because what the book really is about, what I wanted to write about, is what I've mentioned already, that erasure of female equality and the erasure of female divinity. Because what Lilith starts sort of investigating, what she really wants to know is, why is there a father and no mother? And she remembers that there was a mother. She remembers there was a mother. What's happened to the mother? Where's the mother gone? And really, that's the thrust of the book. She's investigating, it's very meta, really, because, she is investigating the disappearance of the Holy Mother, the Mother Goddess, who was there in the early Israelite religion, but who has mysteriously been erased, which is what happened, throughout the first millennium BC, until we get to the story that we recognize, which is that there is only one God. This God is male. He has no need of a female to create life, unlike every other belief system, up until this point. He is all powerful. and there is no mother. And that, to me, is incredibly offensive.
And incredibly significant in terms of where we find ourselves. And Ashra and the Queen of Heaven, is that her role in the book? She is the mother.
So Ashra, in the early Israelite religion, was the mother goddess, because, of course, we're used to thinking of Judaism as a monotheist religion. Of course, that is the understanding of it today, but that's not how it started. It started, like every other religion in that area, as a polytheistic religion. And we have, countless examples of, there's so much archaeological evidence now that this figure Ashra, who we have known about for a really long time, but she has been kind of misinterpreted. There's a sort of famous figurine of her in the Israel Museum where she's called a sacred prostitute, and that is still how she's labeled today. But we have ample evidence now that she was, she is the wife of God. She is the mother goddess, and her. When you sort of think about, she had sort of her. She's connected to all of the other mother goddesses in that part of the world, and they all have very much in common. And Ashura's symbols, the things that sort of identify her when you're in her iconography, the tree is absolutely fundamental to sort of to Ashura. She's represented by the tree. The fruit, which is another symbol of the mother goddess, because it's about fertility, regeneration. The snake, which is associated with wisdom and foresight. Wisdom was always the prerogative of the mother goddess. The snake, very much associated with female wisdom and foresight in the ancient world.
And also what I find, with the story, and you've got that quite clearly in the book, in a way that I think is easily understood, is that Lilith, or women's separation as well from the tree of knowledge, really seems to indicate our separation from education, historically, that we weren't able, and that's still happening around the world as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you want to keep a group of people as inferior, as controlled, you have to deny them education. That's how you do it. And that, as you say, is thousands of years old, and that is one of the mechanisms by which men exert power and control over women, by denying them knowledge and by denying them education.
And then when we get access to those spaces, be it education or, the corporate world, it's that, being grateful that you are there, not rocking the boat, in terms of the structure and the systems that already exist.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
So, it sort of the more I learned about this story, the more I sort of realized what was hidden, the more fascinated I became by it. And that's really what sort of, drove me to write this book.
Yeah, and I love that Lilith visits, and collaborates with the other female biblical characters. I often call collaboration a feminine principle, and competitiveness a masculine one. We need both, but that collaboration part's so important. You introduce Noria. Who was she, and what can you tell us about her?
Now, she's the wife of Noah, and rather famously in the Bible, of course, the women aren't mentioned. So when you get to the story of Noah and the ark, you have, there are, there's on the ark, you've got Noah and his 3 sons who are all named, and you've got Noah's wife and the 3 daughters-in-law, none of whom were named, which annoys me to start off with.
Yes,
but then
and me.
But then it gets so much worse, because after the ark, you then have Noah's sort of generations, found, all the tribes of men. And the Bible then lists 73 descendants of Noah. And I'm petty enough to have counted them. So the Bible lists 73, and they're sort of, each generation, it lists all the sons, the grandsons, the great-grandsons. It goes down to sort of 3rd or 4th generation. And of course, all 73 of the people named are men. There's not a single woman named. And all of these tribes these are the tribes of, the ancient world. And, it's not just, in the Levant, it's everywhere, all the known world. So all of these, all of the progenitors of these tribes are mentioned, as the fathers. There's not a single woman mentioned. And of course, that erases the fact that every single one of these tribes was birthed by a woman, every single person, and none of the women are named. So that's kind of why I wanted to sort of write about that particular. I wanted to bring the story of Noah and his ark into this book, because it's very much one of the clearest examples in the Bible of how women are erased, and specifically how motherhood is erased, how the role of the mother as the progenitress is erased. She's not completely irrelevant, it's everything comes from the father. So that's why I wanted to do it. And the name Narative comes from some Gnostic, there's a Gnostic scripture that sort of tells the story of Narative. Now, the Gnostic scriptures are early Christian scriptures that became considered heretical. So they were, if you were found with them, you would be put to death. So in about the sort of 4th century AD, you had to get rid of anyone who had these scriptures. You had to get rid of them, and some monks in Egypt buried some of these scriptures, and they were discovered in 1945. So that is the only reason we have them, that they were sort of unearthed nearly 2,000 years later. And in this wonderful sort of story that talks about Norea, it mentions that she keeps burning. Noah keeps making arks, and she keeps burning them down. And I just absolutely loved that image, because in that moment, her character just came to me. This character of this very angry woman.
Yeah.
She is very angry, and she's got a lot to be angry about. And it just came to me really that why did she stop burning the arks? Because it was something happened that sort of worked in her favor. And so in my book, what happens is that Lilith arrives, and Nerea, who is a seer, and she is a source of wisdom. She's a descendant of Eve, and she's got a mission, and her mission is very similar to Lilith's. She wants to sort of bring back the mother. She wants to bring back worship of the mother rather than the father. So this becomes her mission. She's going to sort of bring Lilith into the new world on this ark, so that when everything is destroyed, Lilith can start again and bring the mother into the new world. So that's sort of Norea's story in my book. But it kind of also goes into the other, the daughters-in-law who aren't named in the Bible and their stories. Some of those are fascinating as well. There's one of the daughters-in-law of Noah was said to be the first one of the prophetesses at Delphi. She was called the Hebrew Sibyl. And so I kind of had her in mind when I was writing about Sambeth, who is one of the wives. So yes, that's sort of what that part of the story is all about.
Yeah, and as you say, just us having names, in this kind of context of women having names, let alone a backstory to that is so, incredibly important. And moving on to the next character, Jezebel, which we all know that is a term that can be used as a derogatory term against women, who married the king of Israel. What was her story from the past, and what shifts did you make there?
So I came to the story of Jezebel. I had sort of an inkling that I wanted to include her, but I didn't know, other than the basics, as you mentioned, I didn't know much about her. So I went to first of all, I did what I did with all parts of this book. I read the Bible bit first, and then sort of researched to find out the context. So, but when you go back to even the biblical account, so the biblical account is in the 1st and 2nd book of Kings, which is written about 300 years after the events that are going on, which happen around the mid-9th century BC. So the people writing this book are writing 300 years later, and they've got a very clear point that they're trying to make. And this is the point in time when the elders and the scribes of Israel are making a concerted sort of top-down effort to make their religion monotheistic. They want to erase all of the other sort of elements, the polytheistic religion that has come before, and because they see sort of worship of what these other gods as the reason that Yahweh has turned away from them. And the reason they're sort of having, this sort of crisis is because there have been, this terrible crisis, which is the Assyrian invasion of Israel in the 8th century BC, and then the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem in the 6th century BC. And because of those sort of crisis events, the elders decided that this was because people have been worshipping other gods, so we need to go back to worshipping Yahweh alone. So that's the sort of the context of it. But even when you go back to the biblical account, knowing that Jezebel is being written by her enemies, you find a very different story really to the one you think you know. Because when you hear the word Jezebel, you think slut, harlot, whore, immodest. She paints her face. What a total whore.
Yeah, I looked up actually, what the term means before. It said an immoral woman who deceives people to get what she wants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet, even in the biblical account written by her enemies, that's not what's going on at all.
Yeah.
That's not it at all. The reason she's presented as sort of unfaithful or duplicitous is because she worships a different god. She worships Ashra, which again is something that is not very sort of clear in sort of secondary accounts, but it is clear in the biblical account, because the 400 prophets of Ashra are specifically mentioned in the Book of Kings. And in all the secondary accounts, we're told that Jezebel, who came, she's not an Israelite. She came from Phoenicia, which is their sort of neighboring nation. We're told that she worshipped foreign gods, but Asherah is not a foreign god. Asherah is the Hebrew mother goddess. So a lot of these things that we think we know about the story are not actually true, and she is certainly not a harlot or a slut. Not that there's anything wrong with that if she wanted to be like that, but she's not immodest. She's not unfair.
No. And again, we see that narrative time and time again, don't we? That to remove women from the power of their voice is just to call them a slut, etc. We see that in the modern world still.
Absolutely, and it's a way to reduce women's power. It's a way to slander a woman so that you don't listen to what she might be saying.
Yeah, I think we saw it in the Jeffrey Epstein witnesses as an example to the audience.
Yes, yeah, and in the in the grooming cases of Rochdale as well. You don't listen to these girls. They're children. They're talking about children and calling them sluts. Don't listen to them. So it's it's so embedded in our culture. It's still happening in the modern world.
Yeah.
And when you go back to this biblical account as well, it becomes clear, she's also sort of accused of slaughtering the prophets of Yahweh. Now that kind of happens off stage, so it's not really clear whether she has done that or she hasn't. But what is absolutely clear is that Elijah, who is her nemesis, absolutely is slaughtering prophets. He slaughters 450 prophets of Baal just because they're prophets of Baal. And yet, so what's going on here? We have this sort of double standard. Let's say that she has done this thing that she's accused of. Even then, she still hasn't done anything different to Elijah. And in this story, Elijah is the prophet. Elijah is righteous, and she is the most evil woman in the Bible. So you have this sort of immense double standard that women have endured for millennia. And it is always, leveled against women with power. And, that is the reason that Jezebel is so vilified and so slandered, is because she had some power.
Yeah. And what's interesting, Nikki, I did a little stat test a while ago on the top 100 podcasts in the UK, and the male and female divide, and obviously most of the men were in the top spots with their names, and the majority of women who had their full name were crime podcasts. It was about women and demonic bad behavior rather than women and success.
Oh, that's very disappointing.
Yeah, exactly. So we're still there, we're still telling those stories.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, this stuff is still very, very current. Double standards and the modesties, the sort of things that are expected of women and not of men. But they all, for me, sort of have their roots in thousand things that happened thousands of years ago. They all have their roots in how patriarchies emerged in the first place, in my opinion, and that's what fascinates me.
And it keeps playing out. So we move on to 37 AD, where Lilith meets Mary Magdalene, a more common, well-known name, and definitely prostitute comes in to the same sentence with her name frequently. She was a companion to Jesus Christ. What was the narrative shift that you made here?
Well, I was hugely inspired. I mean, it kind of depends which narrative you're going with. The narrative of the Bible presents Mary Magdalene in a very minor role, really. But the Gnostic Gospels, which sort of mentioned earlier, was a huge inspiration for this part of the book, because when they discovered these scriptures that have been buried for nearly 2,000 years in the desert in Egypt, these were scriptures that were very current in early Christianity, and a very, very, very different picture emerges. Not only, a very different picture emerges of early Christianity, as a really diverse range of beliefs that were part of people who called themselves Christians, but specifically what we learn about Mary Magdalene is absolutely fascinating, because we learn that she is not a minor follower of Jesus. We learn that she is by far and away the most important disciple. In fact, she's more than a disciple, she's a teacher, because the other disciples go to her for knowledge that she has that they don't have. And this, as any woman might recognize, starts to cause some conflict, because Peter in particular really doesn't like women being there. He keeps going to Jesus and asking him to get rid of Mary. He tells Jesus that women are not worthy of life. He is constantly sort of coming into conflict with Mary Magdalene. He says she speaks too much. These things, when you read these, these texts that are nearly 2,000 years old, they're so familiar to modern women that it's actually startling to see how old this is. Peter's complaining that when Mary talks, no one else gets a chance to talk. So you get this very, very, very different picture of Mary, and she is absolutely described as Jesus's partner. The word used is kinonos, which means partner. So that is fascinating to me, and I was kind of also inspired by this. There are other examples in the ancient world around this time of prophets who come in pairs, and that is a kind of sort of harks back to the very ancient idea of the sacred marriage, the sort of the union of male and female, in a divine union. And so I very much wanted to present Mary in my book, not as a minor secondary figure, but absolutely a fundamentally equal partner to Jesus. And that is because that's the real theme of the book, really. The theme of the book is that the world that we should be striving for is partnership between men and women. That the alternative to patriarchy is not matriarchy or females dominating men. The alternative is what we have never tried, which is a world of true equality where men and women are in partnership. So I wanted my Mary and Jesus to be an example of that, an example of a true partnership. So this is the part of the book really that does depart most from the sort of the traditional narrative. But it just struck me again how illustrative it is, with Mary being erased from the story again. It illustrates again, how this happened over and over again, that sort of, female divinity and female equality was suppressed every time it kind of raised its head. It would be stamped on. And in this case, it was stamped on by the church, because in about the 4th century AD, the church decided they would stamp down on all of what they considered these heretical sects within Christianity. And by huge coincidence, I'm sure all your listeners will be astonished to learn, it was all of those sects that practiced true equality, where women had leadership positions, where women were true equals to men. Those were the sects that were denounced as heretical. So it's not a thing that happens by accident. It's a thing that happens deliberately. by people in power, by which I mean men in power.
Well, yeah, and of course, even in Ireland, up until 1994, we have the Mary Magdalene laundries and everything that were happening with women and childbirth and stuff there. So,
and this denunciation of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute again, that was a deliberate. That was the Pope who announced that she was a prostitute, with zero evidence, none at all.
Yeah.
Yes. So again, it's just a way to reduce women's power. It's a way to deny women's voices. It's a way to sort of say don't pay attention to her, don't listen to her. She's got nothing important to say. She's just a whore.
Yes, don't step up. And I think I love as well that one thing all your characters, all these women have in common in the book, which I just think we're owning more as women, is we're pretty pissed off. Pissed off with it. We've had enough after 2,500 years.
Yes, a lot of the women in the book are really very angry indeed.
Yeah.
And in fact, Mary, I call her Miriam in my book. That's the sort of the Aramaic version of Mary. She is really not a very likable character. In fact, she's a prophet, and she has a lot to say, and she's got a lot of wisdom, and she's fascinating, but she's not very likable. I don't think you'd want to spend time with her because she's just very spiky, and as many. Sort of people who have got something really extraordinary to say, there's no reason why they should be likable people. So I wanted her to be quite difficult and not necessarily someone that you might warm to. She's difficult.
Yeah.
She's last, to be honest.
Yeah, and I love that because it's important for us all to, as women, embody those parts of ourselves that aren't very likable. And we've got something to say. I was a criminal defense litigator, so I wasn't very likable a lot of the time because that wasn't my job. But by God, did I get criticised for it?
No, I mean, insisting women be likable the whole time is one of the ways that we're kept in our place. As a child being, you're told, oh, that's not very ladylike, or I haven't heard that word in a long time, thank God.
Yeah.
But I remember being told that as a child, or that you are sort of told to be nice so that people like you. You're sort of told to be kind all the time, when men aren't expected to be kind. So you are kind of, it is a way of limiting women's potential and their ability to be a whole range of things, that might not be very nice.
Yeah, 100%. And as you've really beautifully outlined for us, women tend to be missing, blamed, or demonized in historical and religious texts.
Yes.
I think we've outlined a bit of how that's kept us stuck as women in the modern world. But how do you think changing the ancient and dominant narrative for us as women can really help us change our own personal narrative? That being a bit of an example. Anything else to kind of add?
I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think the main thing is that I think we all have to recognize that, for millennia, all of our culture, everything, all of our literature, our philosophies, our belief systems, our religions, the art that we see, these are men's stories, all of them. They are all men's stories. And so everything we think we know about the world has come from the male experience and the male gaze. And I think it is absolutely fundamental to kind of strip away that and get back to women's stories and get back to women's experiences of the world, and to analyze everything that we know or we think we know. I think we should analyze, look at it again and think, hang on, is that a universal experience or is that a male point of view? When you think about the absurdity of male dominated religion, it's the fabric of our culture. Even if you're not a believer, everything we have in the Western world has been built on this story that the world was created by a father, that the father doesn't need a mother, that the father has announced that women are inferior and are there to serve men. Everything we know was built by people who believed that as true.
And even though there's that's the dominant narrative, there's separation between all the religions upon that, which would create most of the wars and everything else, but they are agreed all on the fact that women are inferior. That is the one thing that they're in agreement about.
Yeah, so I think it's fundamental to challenge that narrative whenever you see it. I mean, it's time consuming and exhausting. And the problem is that once you start, you can't stop.
Yeah.
and I, since I sort of spent so long thinking and researching about this book, it's become very, very difficult for me actually to kind of not sort of apply that sort of that questioning that I have to everything. It's sort of become sort of a real obsession, really. But I think it's just so important for to get back to women's stories and women's experiences, and asserting that women's experiences matter, and they are in many situations different to men's experiences. And when people talk about sort of a universal or default, what they're actually talking about is the male experience, and it is fundamental. We have to we have to sort of redress that balance, because if you don't have women's perspective, you're missing. Well, you're missing out on half of humanity. But I think it's fundamentally more important than that, because I think there are. I realise I'm generalising here when I say that there are male qualities and female qualities. But for example, men are more aggressive than women because of testosterone.
Yeah.
And women are generally more nurturing than men because of estrogen, while they have, while they're in their fertile years. You forgot where I was going with this. It's just, if you take away one half of that, you're left with the aggression.
Yeah.
And that's really dangerous. That's really dangerous. I fundamentally think that many of the problems that we have in this world, wars and conflict, are there because you've got unchecked aggression, you've got unchecked need to control other people, you've got unchecked need for hierarchy, all these things that, if you sort of took into account sort of women's experiences and women's beliefs and women's philosophies, I don't think we'd have ended up in that situation.
No, I 100% agree. And yeah, I've been, banging that drum, and then She Rebel, which is why when I read the book, I was like, we have to have you on. It is all about that. And, I keep reminding women as well, we're actually the majority shareholders of the world's population. We are 51%. So if that was a company, we'd get the majority vote. And also, it's checking in with, I think I've certainly found it myself, and, the stuff that I've been doing. And it's quite normal for us as women to sometimes find it difficult to find the language that we're trying to find, because it's again based on the male narrative. So it can be hard for us to articulate sometimes.
Even things like, there's a lot in this book really about that, about the idea of sort of physicality, the idea of the mind body separation, which in my view is a male idea.
Yeah,
because I think
agree.
Women don't have that separation. I think women feel much more connected to their bodies, and they feel much more connected to the world. I think that idea that you've got physicality and spirituality, and spirituality is more important, is nonsense. But I think it's a male idea. I don't think we would have sort of acquired that as our sort of dominant narrative if women had been involved, because I think that comes from a male experience. I think it's possible to sort of, live in a woman's body and, experience menstruation and pregnancy and giving birth and breastfeed, all of those. Not that everyone, not all women choose or have to do that, but it's impossible to do those things and not understand your physicality.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I say separation is a masculine principle and value, full stop. Whereas cohesion and that togetherness is a feminine one. We need both. Sometimes we need to separate to understand things, but actually, we exist as a whole. So, I totally agree with you on that. And even the way that we, traditionally have done education, and studying different parts of the body, we have to put it together to actually understand it as a whole, which is a feminine principle.
And it's that loss of balance. I think
is
so damaging for the world for thousands of years. It's that just loss of balance, the loss of harmony, loss of equilibrium, which is something that in the natural world you see that all the time. You need that balance. You need opposites interact. And when you have a lack of equilibrium, that's when things go wrong, and that's what I think has gone wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think no matter where, anybody is in themselves in the world right now, they all can all agree that there is a lot of disharmony, and something's gone wrong somewhere. So I'm 100% with you there. But before we go, I'd love for you to tell us very briefly, because we are out of time, but about your first book on Wilder Seas. Who was that about, and why did you write that?
So On Wilder Seas was inspired by the true story of a woman called Maria, and Maria was the only woman on board Francis Drake's Golden Hind circumnavigation voyage in the 16th century. And Maria, we don't, the information that we have about Maria is very limited. All we know is that she she was taken. I hate the way she's described in the secondary sources. She joined Drake's ship from a Spanish ship. She was of African descent. We don't know whether she was enslaved or not. It seems likely that she was enslaved on the Spanish ship, but we don't really know about the circumstances in which she joined Drake's ship. She was then on board for 9 months. So she was there for the exploration of North America. She was there for the Pacific crossing. And then 9 months later, she was abandoned on a desert island by Drake, a desert island that had no water supply, and she was heavily pregnant. So that is the story of Maria. And when I first heard about it, I was so horrified, not only about the circumstances of what happened to her, but by the way that story has been cut out of our, what we know about Drake, because the voyage of the Golden Hind is probably the most famous English exploration voyage of all time. Children in the UK learn about Drake very early on. I remember going to the replica of the Golden Hind as a child. At no point did anyone ever mention that there was a woman on board. Not only a woman on board, a woman who was heavily pregnant during the Pacific crossing. No one ever mentions that. So I found that so horrific, and I found her story so emblematic, really, of that whole story of colonialism. Because it's presented as a great adventure, a great exploration, but actually what Drake was doing on that voyage was horrific. He was sort of attacking the Spanish and stealing everything from them, but he was also scoping out parts of what was called the New World for colonial adventures, and that's where he set up the first English colony in the Americas, on the northwest coast of America, in a place he called Nova Albion. And this was really the start of the British. That voyage is the start of the British Empire, because it was later on that his contacts in the Spice Islands further east were the origin of the setting up of the East India Company. So I think without Maria's story, you've got this story of adventure and exploration. When you're reminded about this woman who was there, possibly against her will, that bit's not clear, but when we know her past, her connection to the horrific business of slavery, which Drake was also involved in, you are reminded about the flip side of empire, the flip side of colonialism, the flip side of people going halfway around the world to steal land from other people. That's what drew me to the story.
We do love women and boats on She Rebel Radio, because we've had Anne Bonny and Mary Read, female pirates of the Caribbean. We've had an episode on that by an artist, and the incredible Tracy Edwards, who did the first female yacht race in 1989, 1990, is also part of this series.
Yes, women on boats, and of course there's so much sort of mythology about women on boats, that they're dangerous, that they'll anger the winds, that they will cause shipwreck. There's lots of sort of fascinating sort of women on boat stuff, but actually in the ancient world as well, that connection of women in the sea is really, really strong. That sort of going back to my current obsession, Ashura was the lady of the sea, and that sort of connection between female goddesses and the sea is very, very, very tight. So there is a sort of a connection between women in the sea that I find fascinating.
Yeah, 100%. It's been amazing to have you on. Before you go, do tell us, what are you feeling inspired by in 2024, and where can we find you?
I am feeling inspired by female power. I think the research that I've done for this book has opened my eyes up to so many stories of women's power in the ancient world that I didn't know before, and that I am so delighted to learn, and that is what is inspiring me. And you can find me, I'm sort of on social media. I've got quite a unique name, so I'm very easy to find anywhere. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, but I need to update it.
It's hard to be everywhere.
I'm very easy to find. I think
Yes.
Instagram is my preferred medium because it is much more. I find it less confrontational. I find it less toxic than some of the other social media sites. So
I totally agree. Twitter. Or
yes,
whatever it's called these days. But and you know, testament to the fact when I was reading your book, I connected with you on Instagram, you followed me back, and I was like, yes, let's have a conversation. So thank you so much. I'm really excited about what other work you're going to be doing around, you know, women's power in the ancient world. It's such an important thing for us to have the narrative, you know, as women, with the world, you know, changing as it is, and knowing that we can lead and create a different way.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for having me on, Lulu. I've so enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks so much, Nikki. You've been listening to She Rebel Radio. We thank you for listening and thank our headline partners NatWest for sponsoring this series. If this episode has inspired you, please pass it on and share with at least one other incredible woman, and don't forget to hit subscribe and leave us a review. You can find out more about me and my work at lulumins.com or on most social media platforms.